Hey everyone. Okay, I'm back to talk to you about chapters 3 and 4. I actually am going to just go through the PowerPoint that um, was provided by the textbook. This PowerPoint also is uploaded on Canvas, so you'll actually be able to see all of the PowerPoints for all of the chapters are already on Canvas in the files section of Canvas, and this will help you just kind of with study review and with your quizzes and other things. So I'm not going to go through every slide because I think some of it is self-explanatory. Some of it does give, just some basics of the definitions and vocab and that kind of thing. But I do want to just dive into a little bit about culture, this idea of culture and socialization. Um, and I think this ties back to the chapter from last week. When we think about structure, like the social structure, right? How does our society function? So on one hand, you have, or how does our society function? So our society has institutions that are set up, right? We have the economic institutions like banking and that kind of thing. We have transportation, we have housing institutions, we have food institutions like grocery stores and farmers markets and that kind of thing, and restaurants and food trucks. Um, then we also have schooling as an institution. So each one of these institutions are set up as a way for us to have a functioning society, for us to live in a full, um, our full selves. Um, and and we have to operate within those institutions. There are some rules that and laws. So like there are laws that are set up that are created mostly to help us, be a better society and to be decent human beings. But there are also laws that I kind of brought this up last time. There are also laws that have been created to uh, kind of control certain aspects of society and keep people from being able to access certain resources, right? So the example I gave last week was about um, Asian American immigrants or Asian immigrants who came to the United States to help with laying the track for the railroad in California in the 1800s. And then they decided they wanted to stay, right? So at that point, there was no immigration laws. You just come to America. And and then so they decided, okay, well, I want to stay. I'm here now. I want to stay and continue working and buy land and be a part of the American dream. Well, they created a law to keep them from being able to do that. And so laws can be used both as one as a way to make society better and healthier and safer, but they can also be used as ways to keep people from being able to access that full kind of potential or ideal of the American dream. So that kind of ties into this next chapter when we're thinking about culture. Um, those are kind of like the prescribed de facto, if you will. That's the word that is used a lot. It's not being used in our textbook, which I think is interesting. Um, but the prescribed rules of society. But then there's these latent um, functions, these latent rules, or these lesser known, unknown rules of society. And those are how we would say our culture. So culture manifests in different ways. It manifests, um, a lot of times, the majority of the way that I was trying to look for the terminology in the textbook, um, the the culture. I don't see it in here right now. Manifest. That's what I was looking for. That word manifest is the same as de facto. Okay. So culture, a lot of times what we think about as culture are cultural differences like racial differences, racial ethnic race ethnicity. So a lot of times we think about, you know, different racial ethnic groups, different like countries, and so like say Irish versus Scottish versus British versus Ghanaian versus Nigerian, Caribbean culture, like those kind of cultural differences. But there are also kind of these, what you would call subcultures or mini cultures, cultures that are created through human interaction, symbolic interaction, if you will. These meanings that are created, these rules, these unwritten rules that are created through human interaction. So one of the students last week kind of was talking about being on the soccer team, and how there's like this culture around being in the soccer team, going to practice and playing your hardest, and then other people see that you're playing your hardest in as a soccer player, and then that motivates them to want to work harder and to go harder in their practice so that you can be the best team you want to be. um, Part of that also is, yes, there's this culture that's created, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum. That culture also is influenced by larger society and the institutions that have been set up for us in our society. And so those cultures will differ based on the geographic location. Like a soccer team's culture in Arizona will be different than a soccer team culture in North Carolina, or a men's soccer team will be different than a women's soccer team because of some of the institutional and societal rules around how men and women are supposed to play, right? Or men and women are supposed to be competitive, or rules about, there was a study, actually I think of UNC soccer team, um, and forgive me because a lot of my reference points are from UNC, and I know I'm at Wake Forest now, so forgive me for that if y'all are like major rivals. But so I remember there was a study of the UNC soccer team, women's soccer team. Look, it was actually lacrosse, the lacrosse team, and the women were talking about um, when they joined the team, there was these expectations of being like competitive and like athletic and all of that, but also because they are women, there was an expectation that they were supposed to also be feminine and wear dresses and wear makeup when they're not on the field, or even when they are on the field to wear makeup. Um, and so many of them would join sororities as a way to kind of exert their femininity, because of cultural norms about them being women. Like it was less of a, it's less accepted for them to be masculine or even to be in a same-sex relationship with another woman. And so they would hide, oftentimes they would hide that because of these kind of larger societal expectations about being a woman and a woman athlete and being athletic and being a woman athlete, right? And so these cultures are created because of like larger societal structures, these expectations, these norms about how a woman is supposed to be versus a man. And then even I've heard, so some of my research was on Black men and their masculinity and like pressure to be masculine. And some of the men talked about being on the football team and them like having to suppress their emotions and to perform a certain masculine self as a way to be a part of the football team and be accepted, um, and to have to manage their emotions, manage their pain, manage their kind of feelings of vulnerability as a way to express masculinity. And that was really kind of exacerbated on the football team, on the football field. and they were encouraged to express anger and violence, to be on the football team. Yet in larger society, those things, being a black man, those things come to bite you in the come to bite you, because being portrayed as violent or aggressive or hyper masculine in American society is oftentimes a death sentence for black men. And so there's these conflicts between wanting to fulfill your role and be a part of the culture on the team, but also being afraid of what that may mean for you in the larger world, right? So some of these cultures are created through symbols, right? So um, uh, like using flags or using the team name. Um, so the team name and the mascot, like for example, the Redskins, the Washington Redskins, and using that symbol to create a whole culture around, like, the football team is ideally supposed to be, aggressive and instill fear. And so they came up with this, they decided to use a symbol of the Washington Redskins. But the Redskins, first of all, is not a name of any American Indian tribe. So that name is based in a racist stereotype. Um, and then but then the symbol creates this kind of whole culture around Washington Redskins being, you know, intimidating and going to dominate the Cowboys, right? The Cowboys. So these narratives that come from sports are also tied to historical context, right? That the Cowboys were going to go out and kill and fight the the American Indians, and that, and fighting over land and territory. The irony is that they're trying to portray them as equal, but oftentimes the American Indian population were at a disadvantage because they, even though they were native to that land and owned that land, they did not have the weapons, they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the um, backing of the U.S. government to do this work. And so that, using those symbols in sports um, can be insulting and offensive to the actual history and the actual context, right? And so, and then also using that language of redskin actually disassociates it from the actual community and people who it's supposed to be honoring or representing. And so those are just some examples. I'm just trying to dive a little bit deeper into how these, understanding, like using sociology. Sociology is a way for us to kind of readily identify these processes, and how culture is created, and also not to just take it for granted that this thing, like a culture, exists, but that it is created through symbols, language, values, norms, and rituals, but that also happens within the context of a larger social structure in society. So symbols, um, the American flag for many people holds, and I think this is becoming more and more evident in the popular culture conversations that are happening in the news and happening around politics and the campaign trail. These symbols, American flag, right? For example, and I'm going to send you a link to a podcast that I did a couple of weeks ago. Um, Thinking about the American symbol, Frederick Douglass gave a famous speech in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July, and he talked about the American flag as this symbol of, like, having a conflict, especially for African American community members, having a conflict with that flag and that symbol um, because African Americans fought in every war. Um, and fought for the ideals and values of the United States, yet also were not able to realize the full kind of privileges of those ideals and values of freedom, of liberty, of kind of the pursuit of happiness. And so the symbol, the American flag, has a different meaning for oppressed groups than it does for people who have experienced the full extent of those values. And so, let's see here. Yeah, so the language also kind of conveys those ideas and influences people's behavior. So, for example, along the same lines, when we talk about um, yeah, okay. So, for example, there's a lot of conversation right now about, um, you know, politically correct language, um, especially around LGBT populations. North Carolina is very interesting and unique because it's made the news quite a bit about the use of uh, bathrooms and transgender persons being able to enter into the bathroom of the sex that they were assigned at birth versus the sex that they identify with. Um, Rather, actually, the sex they assigned at birth versus the gender that they identify with. So, um, or even using the language gender queer, right? Versus just saying I am a man or I am a woman, um, and using that language. We kind of think of language as maybe sometimes superficial, but it really does have power in the way that it helps people articulate their identity. It helps people articulate their belonging in certain spaces. um, it creates cultural norms around how to treat and how to accept or not accept certain things in society. And and so it does, the language that we use does influence our perception of genders, races, and ethnicities. um, and it's also the irony is that it takes a lot of protests and movement and scholarship and writing and movies and media and all of those things to finally actually make changes in language and to change those norms. Like, humans are very hard to like get out of what we're used to. um, so I think the textbook did a good job of kind of giving examples of what are some of the uses of the word black and the use of the word white, um, and how black oftentimes is used as something negative. And I even hear a lot of times people hesitate on like calling someone black, or like saying, oh, she's a black woman or a black man, because we have been socialized to think that the word black means something bad, um, when in actuality, like, I prefer to be called black, and a lot of people prefer to be called black because we have, in our subculture or kind of community, embraced it as an identity. But in a larger society, there is a privilege associated with not even having to call yourself a race or ethnicity. You just are. You're white because you're normal, right? And so there's kind of the um, the social structure and the history inform how we use these words and what we take for granted or not in using these words to describe people and things. Okay. I think I'm not going to go into like that kind of stuff. Let's see. Rituals. Yes. Rituals also kind of go into our norms in society. Um, and there's some universals that kind of all of us see as important across different cultures and across different geographic areas. There's subcultures, there's counterculture, multiculturalism. Okay. So I wanted to also dive into this multiculturalism thing because I'm not sure that the textbook did a great job of explaining it. And I'm sure we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it in other areas of the book. But this is something that I think is especially happening and kind of coming into the forefront of popular culture and popular conversation right now. Um, I have to push pause for a second. Okay, sorry. Um, Share my screen again. Okay, so what I was saying was that um, there's ideals in U.S. society about us living in a multicultural society, and this idea that we're in a melting pot and that everybody, we believe in multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is a great ideal, but it doesn't always operate that way in reality. And part of the reason why I say that is because even though we have a coexistence of several cultures in the same geographical area without one, that doesn't necessarily mean that one culture is not dominating the other. So, going back to previous examples of how, um, there's norms around using the words white and black, right? That don't, a lot of white people don't identify with the word white. Like they don't have to um, acknowledge that they're white. They don't have to think about being white. It doesn't really kind of affect their day to day lives. While Black or Latino or Hispanic does. And I think I did this before. And, um, you know, for example, when you look up, and this is the extent to which whiteness becomes a part of our everyday society, right? And is normalized. So the extent to which the word band-aid, which is a race neutral thing, right? But the skin color matches people who are lighter skinned and is normed around whiteness and white people. I have a privilege also because I am a lighter skinned Black person that this band-aid matches my skin color. But so it's biased toward those people. And recently, I'm sure you've seen in the news that they just started to like do better about the kind of diversity of skin colors for band-aids. But that's just one example of how we think about multiculturalism and saying that one culture doesn't dominate the other. But when we do think about domination, is also comes in the form of normalization and thinking that it's the default. And so that's just one example. You can also think about uh, the temperature, the room temperature. A lot of times in office spaces, the room temperature is super cold. And we're like, why is it so cold? Oh my God. Women oftentimes are freezing, oftentimes in offices because the temperature is set around what an average man's body temperature would be. Um, and not around a woman's average body temperature, which tends to be, we need to be in warmer environment. And so those are kinds of things about like norms that set a culture that kind of contradicts our idea that everything is equal and not one culture is dominating another. Okay, so I want to give you another example um, that ties into education. Um, the school system, and I think this also is just, this pandemic has just been really interesting about. So, for example, the school system, there's an expectation that, Bourdieu talked about this, where there's a high society, high culture, that, and the idea that if you go to school, that will create the opportunities and kind of socialize you to be productive members of society and be successful and move up in society, move up into the social ranks. And so some of the norms that are kind of taught in schools are to socialize kids to sit still, be quiet, pay attention, to read. They teach them fundamental skills as well, like reading and writing and math. But there's also this kind of socialization and social culture. There's also these like unwritten rules, expectations that parents are supposed to be involved in their children's education, and that they are just as much teachers and they support the homework and the kind of learning environment of the children. However, that is based on an old premise of how families work. The idea that the mother would be at home to help the children with their homework and be involved in parent teacher association and be involved in these committees and providing snacks and those kinds of things. And if the parent is not doing those things, then they don't care. Then there's this kind of assumption that they are not conforming to the culture and that they are not taking care of their children or care about their children's education. However, and so we see that, even in popular culture now, I've seen like videos of kids on Zoom with their teachers, and then, a lot of kids are not on Zoom, or they're not paying attention, or they're not doing their homework, or there's people in the background doing crazy stuff. And yet the school system and that school structure and that culture around kind of family-based education and involvement in education is based around a middle class model, a white middle class model of the family and the family structure. Even the calendar year is set up based on original kind of agricultural norms of the children going to school early and then going home in the evening to help on the fields. So why do we have school so early? Why do we have school during the fall months and not during the summer? So they could take off and go work on the fields during the summertime, right? And this expectation of involvement of the parents is based on this idea that there's a parent at home who has the time and the resources to do those things. And so if a student is not conforming to that, or their family is not conforming, then they get labeled as a problem child or disengaged, and then are treated in a certain other way, right? So I'm gonna actually do a quick interview with the executive director of the Diversity Inclusion Office at Guilford County Schools, because she actually has designed interventions and an intervention based on this Bourdieu's kind of theoretical model around culture and the ability for certain groups to navigate the school system. And she's creating interventions that are trying to make it more equitable and provide resources for students who don't have those resources that conform to this middle class norm of what education is supposed to look like. So I will be excited to show that to you all. I'm going to record it on Thursday and then post it to YouTube for you to watch. So this is not for me to go through every slide, but just to kind of give you an overview and give you some examples and kind of tie it to popular things that are going on in the media. But feel free to review the rest of these, the key terms, and some other examples, and kind of helping you break it down. So I'm going to also, I had a, I want to go over chapter 4, socialization. I think I've already given you some of these examples in chapter 4 from the previous kind of lecture, but just want to make sure I dive a little bit into other things. And you all let me know if there's questions or you're confused about things, or you want me to dive into something a little bit deeper. I can certainly do that in these lectures. Okay, so nature versus nurture. um, I think this also goes back to, there's a lot of debate right now, especially in American society, about people, why don't you just work harder and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you should be happy to be in America, and that America is the land of the free and has all these liberties, and so, if you're not successful, it's because you are not working hard enough and you are inherently lazy, right? So this goes into this nature. Who are you as a person, as a human being? Are you naturally lazy? And is this a characteristic of who you are, versus the environment that you're growing up in, and the policies and the infrastructure and the culture, right, that shape your ability to enact certain behaviors that conform to or make you successful in society. Um, so that nature versus nurture debate. And a lot of times, even in public health, there's a lot of interventions that are, like, ask people to say, like, okay, with losing weight, like, okay, exercise, eat healthy, we're going to educate you about certain kind of nutritional facts and that kind of thing, but it is your own individual responsibility, and within your own nature, it is within you to overcome your obesity issues, right, and your diabetes issues and heart disease issues. However, a lot of times the interventions or the suggestions that we give people do not take into account the environment or the nurturing aspect of people's lives, right? The idea that there are, there may not be sidewalks in the neighborhood for them to go walking, or the bus stop is, however many miles away. And so, or that they live in a city limit that's close to a chemical plant that is polluting their air, or that they are working extra hours, and don't have the time to cook, or and don't have the income to buy healthy food. And so, you know, coming up with these, you have to take both into account. It's not one or the other. And really, even this debate between nature and nurture is kind of arbitrary, because we already know that there are inherent capabilities, inherent qualities with each one of us that we're born with and that we inherit genetically from our families. But there are also that does not exist by itself. It has to interact within an environment. um okay, so the difference between males and females, I'm not going to dive into this stuff. I think y'all get this stuff. But yeah, so this is a good one. The example of, like, going back to the transgender conversation. Someone may be born and assigned the sex of male, but they feel that they identify as a female. Um, it's interesting because I wish I could dive into this deeper, but I'm just going to give you an overview. In the sex and gender class that I taught, we really dove into this idea that you have the genetically, even and biologically, men and women have the capability to be one gender or the other. And so when you're when you're developing in the womb, there are certain hormones that express themselves that then um, allow a person to become male or female. However, with the manipulation of hormones, you can actually reverse that and change genders. And so that is something biologically that each one of us have the capability to do. The and so, it does help us, and it causes us to question this nature versus nurture, right? So like if someone is born male, um, that doesn't necessarily inherently mean that they're going to be aggressive, or that they are going to um, you know, boys will be boys kind of mentality, that they're going to be aggressive, or that they just need to be out in nature, or they need to do, be into cars and trucks and violence. Those are things that are socialized into boys, and girls can want those things as well. And also the idea that we have the full biological capability to be the opposite gender, which really calls into question some of the norms and culture that we have around being masculine or being feminine. I think this socialization, I talked about that a little bit with the research that I did on Black men's pressure to be masculine, and how that also kind of layers itself onto the race question, and how Black men experience, you know, additional pressure, not only to be masculine and conform to masculine norms about being the breadwinner and being aggressive and that kind of thing, but also avoiding and managing stereotypes, racial stereotypes that are tied to them, and navigating that in their environment. Okay, so on average, 49% of individual differences are genetic and 51% are environmental. So they're both important. You can't have one exist without the other. The social environment can enhance or dampen biological characteristics. And the same can be said for expression of health conditions, right? So living in a certain, like people who maybe their family member has alcoholism in the family, that doesn't necessarily inherently mean that the person born into that family is going to be an alcoholic. They have to be exposed to stressors and oftentimes traumatic events, or kind of mental health problems, or social pressures that cause them to drink, and then over time using that drinking as a coping mechanism for things that are happening in their lives, that then triggers a genetic response that predisposes them to abusing alcohol. So you can't have one without the other. So people learn new attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors through social interaction. I think we've already talked about that. And there are things that are directly taught versus observing, like how your father ties his tie and interacts with your mother, or or his spouse or partner, versus what you're taught as, like, this is how you do XYZ thing. Um, I can't see this title. Social learning, critical evaluation. Okay, so this, what I think I enjoy about these PowerPoints is that it also does give you some kind of what's the strengths and weaknesses of these theories. That's a theory, right? This nature versus nurture, but there's still, there's always criticisms. People are always criticism. We don't. I think what I want you all to kind of gather from sociology also is that you shouldn't just take these theories at face value and say that they are completely accurate, right? Part of this is that critical thinking. Does this theory apply to my life? Does it apply? Have I seen it in society? So my life is one empirical kind of study or example, but then also gathering data and empirical evidence from multiple groups, multiple points in time, multiple sources of information to evaluate an overarching kind of understanding of whether this theory works or doesn't work. Does it only work for certain populations? Does it only work for certain points in time? And does it, so the whole goal is for you to use, to think about a theory, learn it, but then also use data to assess whether that theory is accurate or not, and in what context are they accurate or not. Okay. So the symbolic interaction, I'm going to go back to the example of um, the black men. I also, part of my research was examining black gay men and how kind of the pressures around masculinity and identity conflicts between being black and gay and male all affected a person's identity, or if they had identity conflicts, right? And so you can, the way that we kind of formulate our identity, we don't, like I said before, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a geographic context, within a group, within a status, within a culture, and within a social structure and social institutions. Now, all of those influences shape our self, our sense of identity. And they happen through interactions with each one of those entities, with your parents, with your family, with your community, your neighborhood, your community, your school, your teachers, the other institutions like the media, and your identity could even be shaped by your interaction with transportation, and other things, right? So, in addition to that, it's an interaction with other people, but then it's also kind of a self-image on how we think others see us. So, for example, with black gay men, many times the men would explain to me that they would moderate their external behavior, their masculine behaviors, like how they held their hands or how they spoke or how they walked or what kind of clothes they wore, based on what they thought other people perceived of them and what they perceived of a masculine man, and trying to conform to that and reduce any kind of stigma tied to being black and gay, black male and gay. um, of course, the most critical social interaction is in the family. And a lot of times with the black gay men, they would experience rejection from their mother or their father. And that then shaped their identity, and thinking that who they were was wrong. And so, but and then of the men who did have positive interactions with their mother or their father, they did not learn that, right? They learned more so that it was okay to be black and gay, and it was okay to be a masculine person or a feminine person, and embodied in this in this identity. And so those kind of interactions are crucial to us also kind of understanding the long-term outcomes of people in society. Um, so this kind of goes through the stages of how people develop a sense of self and how they're socialized into society and socialized on what kind of personas they can take on. And so Goffman talks a lot about like in different kind of contexts, they take on different personas based on what they think are the norms in society and trying to mitigate or minimize the amount of stigma that they have or it may experience in those different roles. So you kind of learn through play and interaction with others on what are the norms, what's accepted, what's not accepted, and then that helps shape who you are as a person. And so there's, right now I'm performing in the role of professor. um, I may also perform in the role of associate director or daughter or sister or aunt, right? And so yes, I say aunt, not aunt. I'm from Texas. We say aunt. And so, those things matter. And the roles differ depending on the context. Okay. Um, I think we've kind of talked about this already, this idea about downplay, the macro level factors that affect how people make decisions and how people interact with society. You can't look at people in a vacuum. You have to understand their context and the environment they're in and how the decisions they make about their health and about their interactions with others and about their own identity are also shaped by the interactions with those institutions and groups. Okay, so we all know that you get socialization from different groups like family, parents, siblings, grandparents. um, and then there's different parenting styles that also affect how someone kind of learns to be in society. um, there's the authoritarian, like big on punishment, big on discipline. And each one of these, there's going to be hybrids. There's going to be people who maybe are parents who kind of cross over multiple stages or multiple styles. You have the authoritative who provides guidelines and boundaries, but also is loving and supportive, maybe a little bit controlling. The permissive one who just kind of lets the kids run around and do whatever they want, um, and be a totally independent. And then the uninvolved are the people who, I think this goes back to that example of the schooling, right? This idea, the culture around schooling is that parents are supposed to be involved. And if they are not showing up to parent teacher association or not helping their kids with homework or things like that, we assume that they're uninvolved parents. That is not necessarily always the case. The parents and the children are interacting with a system that was not set up to be beneficial or tailored to their lived experience as a parent who is single and needs to work, right? And so if we were to change the norms or change the structure around how we school children, say it's a collective, right, of kids who meet at someone's house and they learn skills and they learn math and science and reading and all of that in a group, and it's the parents and co-parents and extended family members who are responsible and not just the parent, then that would actually be a little bit more supportive to the working parent who has to leave their children at home, right? um, and can't necessarily always help with homework, or who doesn't speak the language, or whatever the case may be. And so then we may even change our narrative about whether they're involved or uninvolved parent. Um, So y'all can gonna, this is just like a little quiz. Um, and then you also kind of learn how to socialize. You're socialized in your peer groups. So first is family, then the second is like your friendship groups, um, and playing with with other kids and playing with your friends. That how you teaches you additional norms that you learn about how to be a boy, how to be a girl, what race means. We do learn those kind of rules, racial differences early on. And a lot of times people kind of assume that kids don't pick up on those things, but they do in interactions in the playground and with their parents. So, for example, I remember when I was a kid and I was on the playground, I was playing with I grew up in Texas, in Dallas, and I was playing with two girls of Hispanic, like Latinx girls, and another African American boy who was darker skinned. And we were all playing together, we were all running on the playground. And then the girls pulled me aside and said, "We only want to play with you. We don't want to play with him anymore." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because he's black." And I said, "Well, I'm black too." And then they said, "Well, but you're light skinned. You don't look black, so it's okay." And those are things that we were like 6 or 7 years old, and I remember that. I would never forget that. And some of that is learned from their parents, but it's also reinforced on the playground, right? These racial differences and racial hierarchy, and also gender differences, that are played out in your kind of peer groups. You also get these messages from toys, from cartoons, from TV shows, from movies that also reinforce those things. You get them from the schools and from teachers. How does the teacher treat this kid versus the other kids? Um, and in as far as disciplinary, being disciplined, and motivating kids, right? Kind of said this already about electronic media and advertising. And you know so this just talks about the different stages of growing up, um, and kind of what you go through in each one of these stages. And then, like I said before, it's very difficult to re-socialize yourself or to change behaviors once you've learned them. That's the hardest part, and especially if it happens against a person's will. But sometimes it does take changing the environment or changing the structure, changing the laws against an individual person's will, but maybe to match the new norms of the larger society, to re socialize a whole society. Um, and there's ways that you can try to build a new identity by changing the institution. Um, Attempt to build a new identity that conforms to the institution's expectations, but it doesn't always succeed in re-socializing people. Like, you can change the laws, you can say that all people are equal, or you can change the laws around policing, or you can change the laws around schooling, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to automatically just change their attitudes about those things. And so it does take quite a bit of also social interaction, time, and maybe even some positive reinforcement of those new norms for someone to actually be re-socialized. I have one question that wasn't necessarily posed in here, but this idea that um, people who go to jail are supposed to be rehabilitated and re-socialized. What do you think about that? Do you think that that is something that actually works and is a productive means for rehabilitating and re-socializing people, or not, and why not, based on the things that we've learned in the reading so far. Okay, I know this was super long, but I just wanted to make sure that I gave you all some kind of additional feedback and context around the readings.